Good evening. So I'm Dominique. I'm the social worker at Changes Rehab, and I just wanted to say that today we're going to just really talk about the stages of relapse. I think relapse is it's something that's like really common in recovery circles. Unfortunately, I think not a lot of people get recovery right the first time. Relapse does happen, but we always call it it's always a process, not an event. So when we want to look into relapse prevention, what we need to do is understand how relapse works, what the stages of relapse are, what the progression of a relapse looks like, because the relapse is not so much about just picking up the substance, because I think that's a very common misconception, is that everyone thinks, well, because I've had a drink or I've done some drugs, I've picked up a drink, I've done some drugs, smoked a joint, or whatever the addiction is, that means I've relapsed. But the relapse actually happens long before the physical act of it, where someone actually physically picks up a substance or a behavior even. So it's what I think is quite important for you as families as well, is just to kind of know more or less what to look out for in terms of signs, symptoms, behaviors that might stand out for you, where you can actually kind of gauge more or less where your loved one is in their recovery process. So we can go to the next slide, please. Okay. So when we talk about addiction, often we talk a lot about triggers. So people that drink and use drugs generally have what they call triggers that push them to drinking and using, whether that's a person, whether that's a situation. They always say, look, I was triggered and that's why I used substances, because I didn't know how to cope. So if we look at the 10 most common triggers of a relapse or even of substance abuse, we look at people, places, and things. So that would be, hanging out with using buddies or drinking buddies, or hanging out with the wrong crowds at school, or whatever, let's call them bad influences they are on your loved one, is the people that they would hang out with. Abusive partners, people that, hanging out with drug dealers or gangs, that's kind of the environment, or what we say dangerous people would be for that. Then we have places. So obviously, the youngins maybe go clubbing, hanging out in pubs, brothels, strip clubs, places where generally addiction or usage is vastly high. But also the thing with places is there could be a fine line, because sometimes dangerous places could be with family members. Dangerous places could be in an abusive relationship. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, like we see in the movies, where people are hanging out in clubs and pubs and raves, and, that's where the drug usage usually happens. And then when we talk about things, it's really just, sort of drug paraphernalia, pornography, items that they would use, like a bong, for example, for marijuana smokers, just sort of certain things that might trigger someone. So those are generally the three biggest ones. We then have what we call withdrawal symptoms, which I think most of you should know about, in terms of like when we suddenly stop a substance, our body has like a physical reaction to that. Which the most obvious would be, there would be a lot of anxiety, physical weakness, shaking, nausea. So it would be like the withdrawal is usually the physical side of when you put a substance abuse down, or like when you put a substance down. I will get into process addictions, because withdrawal is obviously a little bit different. It's not so much a physical thing, but withdrawal could also be, in terms of like the anxiety, or something that would push them to want to use a substance because they're feeling uncomfortable. That's usually followed with a post-acute withdrawal, which is more like your mental side of it. So it would be anxiety, irritability, mood swings, anything like they would become snappy with you. So that usually follows the physical withdrawal. Sometimes withdrawal can be quite bad, that people don't want to stop using because it's too painful. So they'll just they'll try to stop. They won't be able to because it'll be too painful, and therefore they would then pick up another substance in order for that to work for them. The next one is relationships and sex. And I know that every time I do this lecture in primary care, I get laughed at when I speak about the relationships and sex aspect. You know, particularly getting into a relationship in early recovery. So, for example, your loved ones just come out of treatment, they go to an NA or an AA or a CA meeting or a rally or a convention, and they fall in love with someone. Or even it happens in treatment sometimes where exclusive relationships can develop, and this kind of develops into an unhealthy, toxic environment for your loved one to be in. And sex is also, it's an outlet. You know, it can be an addiction. It can be quite a serious addiction because there's a lot of guilt and shame associated with sex addiction. And generally, if you can't love yourself, you can't love the other person. So generally doesn't work out. 9 times out of 10, relationships in early recovery don't work. It could be an existing relationship where the dynamics are quite toxic. For example, your loved one might be in an abusive relationship or in a relationship with someone that uses. So relationships and sex is quite a large factor in terms of relapse and even just in using in general. We then have, sorry guys, we just poor self-care. I think this is also something you would notice pretty much off the bat if your loved one was sort of, say, heading towards a relapse. When someone is in active addiction, they have very poor self-care. They won't shower, they won't eat, they don't sleep properly. They, you know, the house is messy. And we get a lot of that when people come into treatment for the first time, or newcomers come into treatment, and then the guys that have been there for a couple of days or weeks complain because the new guys don't make their beds, they don't clean up after themselves in the bathroom, they just expect everyone to do the dishes for them. So that's also just a general, you know, when someone is working and in recovery, they'll take really good care of themselves. But if they start to slip, say, for example, into a depression or into a lack of motivation, the poor self-care would come up there. Uncomfortable emotions is a big one because a lot of people drink and use to cover up or hide or avoid or get away from emotions that they don't enjoy feeling. So often in primary, we'll teach them, sit with your feelings, learn to identify your feelings, be able to process those in a healthy way and regulate those in a healthy way, as opposed to trying to avoid it by using substances. Anger is a big one. So that's also something like anger and resentment usually always leads to using, and nobody's taking responsibility for that. We also have pride and overconfidence, where if you have a loved one that's been in treatment for some time, life is going better, everything's going well, got a promotion at work, family trust me again, sometimes they can get a little bit, the ego can come up quite substantially, and they think, okay, I've got this, I don't need to do as much meetings, I don't need to see my sponsors often. And then they'll slowly start to slip away from the program, and the old behaviors will start to come back. And lastly, isolation. Isolation is a very sad place for any addict or alcoholic to be. They get stuck in their head, they start obsessing, and a lot of that behavior, like thinking, we call it stinking thinking, likes to come back. Okay, we can move to the next slide, please. All right, so just briefly from here, we're going to look at the 3 different stages of relapse. We've got what we call an emotional relapse, a mental relapse, and a physical relapse. So what I am going to do is I'm going to break each of those down, and then we're going to sort of work through them step by step. So I think we can move to the next slide. I think the first one is the emotional relapse. So this is the first of the 3 phases, as I've mentioned. And what happens in this stage is that the addict is not actively thinking about using drugs or substances or whatever, but their emotions and behaviors might be setting them up for a relapse down the road. Next slide, please. Okay. So we're going to look at some signs of, you know, some of the warning signs of an emotional relapse, right? Like I said, here they're not actively thinking about using. This is something that's very unconscious in most people in recovery. They don't really see it coming. They don't understand it. It doesn't make sense. they kind of carry on, and people will say, are you okay? And they'll be like, yeah, sure, I'm fine. So what they start to do during this stage is that they'll start bottling up emotions. They stop going to recovery support group meetings. A lot of the time, the excuses will be, oh, I've just had such a long day at work. I'm tired. I'm not feeling up to it. So they'll start to isolate away from the fellowship. And then they generally start to isolate from peers and family. Whereas, like, if there's a family function, oh, I don't feel like going because Joe Soap's going to get so drunk and it's going to trigger me, and I don't want to do that. So they'll come up with many, many, many excuses. Like I mentioned before, there's the poor eating and sleeping habits, where, for example, if someone is generally depressed, they're not going to want to get up. They're not going to want to go to work. They're not going to want to shower. They're going to pretty much lie in bed and not focus on themselves. They might not eat. It's just that's sort of what happens when people start to isolate. They'll start making excuses as to why they can't go to family functions. So a lot of this, like, emotional depressive, if I can call it that, behavior normally comes up in this stage of relapse. So it'll also be what we call compliance, where they'll go to meetings, but they won't share their experience. They will not really tell you honestly how you're feeling or how they're feeling. There's a lot of dishonesty that starts to come into play. They start focusing on everybody else's problems instead of their own. So they start, shifting or avoiding by saying, okay, but, you're the one with the issue because you're the one who swore at me, and, like, that's why I've gone to drink and use. And they're not managing their anxiety, their anger, or other emotional problems in a healthy way. So normally someone's feeling angry or feeling down, they'll go see a psychiatrist, they'll go see a psychologist, they'll go talk to someone about their problems. If they're in the recovery, they'll start speaking to a sponsor, whereby, the sponsor, obviously, there's another lecture on it, but just in general, someone that's like a life mentor that's been through recovery. Like, if I'm having a bad day, I'll phone up my sponsor and I'll say, look, I really had a bad day. I'm feeling really down. I can't figure it out. And then the sponsor generally helps them work through it, or they'll share about it at a meeting. That's what they should be doing. If they're not doing these things, then it is quite a big warning sign. There'll be a lot of intolerance, mood swings, defensiveness. Like, if you come home and you say to your loved one, look, are you okay? I can notice you're a bit down. They'll get snappy. They'll be like, I'm fine. I don't know what you're talking about. Pretending like everything's okay. They don't ask for help. I think I mentioned the poor self-care, and then they're not having any sober fun or taking time for themselves. We always talk about recovery. You got to put your recovery before everything else, but I always think practicing some self-care within a recovery circle is also really, really important. So we can move to the next slide, please. Okay. So what you do as family, because we often say this in second conjoints, or in some family groups, is that we generally encourage you. It's your loved one's responsibility to take control of their lives and work their recovery. It's not your responsibility to baby them. But what you could do, if you notice someone that's showing any of those symptoms, you can make them aware of their behavior and say, look, I've noticed that you're like, you've been really down, you've been isolating a bit. Like, are you okay? How can I help you? As opposed to, like, you should be going to a meeting, seeing your sponsor, they've got to come to that realization. But I think for you, it's just to show some loving support, and some care around that one. They can become, denial is a very common thing when we slip back into old patterns. They start to feel uncomfortable. They'll obviously get defensive when they get confronted. So then they become obviously very restless and irritable, because they're not dealing with the emotions in a healthy way, and they are just pushing themselves deeper and deeper into a hole of, like, I can't cope with all these emotions. Let me do what I know best. So I think for you as family, it's really important just to, make your loved ones aware of what you are seeing. Not to, I don't want to say doctor them or push them in a way to say you have to do this and you have to do this, but just make them aware of that behavior, and hopefully they can take a step from there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So a lot of times when we look at the emotional side of it, there's always a lot of, there's a fear of judgment, there's a fear of failure. If I'm not doing recovery right, my family are going to kick me to the curb, my family are going to judge me. They don't really want to share how they're feeling, because sometimes, like I say, there's that worry of judgment. If they do share how they're feeling, it's really crucial at this stage. If they can pull themselves out of a relapse cycle in the mental stage, it's a lot better for them, because it's a lot easier to get out of the mental stage than it is as we go further down the line. Simple things like practicing self-care, making sure they're getting enough rest. If people are tired and exhausted, they want to escape. And when the tension builds, the addict becomes a greater risk of moving to stage 2. So what happens is, like when I say that as well, it's bottling things up. It's like a pressure cooker. They'll bottle and bottle and bottle and bottle, and eventually the pressure cooker will just explode. And then what happens is we move into the mental relapse. So I think we can go to the next slide. Okay. So this stage is obviously a little bit more difficult as they move through the lines. Now they've bottled things up, they haven't dealt with their emotions, they haven't spoken or reached out for help, they're not practicing any self-care, they don't work on any of those symptoms. There's obviously that increased risk of them transitioning into the second stage of relapse. When they're in a mental relapse, it's usually described as a war going on within their mind. This is like, I want to use, I don't want to use. I know that that's going to make me feel better, but it has adverse reactions or consequences, or, it's not going to solve me in this way, but it might solve me in this way. So there's like this really like back and forth argument that your loved one is going to have with themselves. I want to, but I don't want to. I know I can, but maybe I can just have one, but then it doesn't end up being one. So obviously they run the risk of becoming, moving forward towards a physical relapse. So this is where they'll start fantasizing about their using, which is not uncommon. They go deeper into that mental relapse. They start, like I say, fantasizing, glamorizing, and as they get further into this, it diminishes the need to escape that section, that part of, that emotional stuff and that mental stuff. What I often say in recovery is, if someone is working a solid recovery program, thoughts of using are going to come up. It's just inevitable. It's human nature. Addicts and alcoholics only know one thing to survive, and that's to use and drink. So those thoughts are going to pop up where, at least, like, I had such a fight with my wife. If I go and have a beer now, I'll feel better. But they need to be able to use the tools that they're given to get out of that. If they start obsessing about that thought and they don't pull themselves out of that, that's when they run the risk of a relapse. So that's quite important to bear in mind. And I think, like I say, it's shouldn't I? Maybe I can have one, maybe two won't hurt. That's where we sit with when we get into a mental relapse. We can move to the next slide, please. Okay. So we look at the signs of a mental relapse. This is where they'll start to have cravings or physical and physiological urges to use drugs or alcohol. Like I say, that obsession kicks in, because I think the big book states that it's an allergy of the body and an obsession of the mind. The mind, if it keeps turning and they keep thinking, that's what I want, that's what I want, that's what I want, they're going to have a drink or do a line, and then that's going to trigger that allergy, and they're just going to be using more and more and more. So they can never go back to just having one drink or just having one joint. They have to stop and abstain completely. They'll start thinking about all the people and places and things that they used to associate with, and how, they had some good times and it wasn't all that bad. And they'll start trying to convince themselves that it's not that bad. And we often say this is a disease of forgetfulness. So what that means is, like, the longer I stay clean, or the longer I start obsessing about how good it was, I'm going to forget how bad the consequences were. Um, and that's why we always encourage them. This is a lifelong process. You have to keep going to meetings. You have to keep hearing other addicts share their experiences. Otherwise, they just get stuck in the cycle of obsession. They'll then start to hang out with their old friends that are using or drinking. I haven't seen Joe Soap for a while. I'll go have a cup of coffee. And while you're having the cup of coffee, Joe Soap is having a beer, because they don't actually respect your recovery whatsoever. They'll start, like I said, minimizing the consequences or past use and glamorizing. I went to that jail, it was so great. And it really wasn't that bad. I felt fine. I could go to work the next day. And then they'll start to just get into that cycle. Something that they can often quite do is, they'll start bargaining. They'll start to think of scenarios in which would be acceptable to use. And a common example is when addicts give themselves permission to use on holidays or visiting family. I think for me personally, Christmas and New Year is a very difficult time for people in recovery, especially early recovery. I mean, we associate that with family functions, lots of alcohol, lots of drugs. It's for me, that's just a really good excuse to use. But they'll start to be like, oh, but it's New Year's, or it's my birthday, or we got a promotion. So they'll start to kind of justify that it's okay. They'll start to think that they can relapse. If it's in a controlled way. So I know I can just have one and I'll stop at that. So those are just some of the signs there that you can look for. Please, can we go to the next slide? Okay. So bargaining can also take the form of switching one addictive substance for another. So this is often where we get something called cross addiction. And it's where people will be like, okay, I know that I can't smoke meth because it puts me in a state and I become psychotic and I don't sleep for days and I have massive consequences. We hurt me because it's now. So they'll start to kind of look at how to kind of deal with their emotions or get through their pain by not using their substance of choice and moving on to something else. They will start to lie. They will start to think of ways to better control their using. They will start looking for relapse opportunities, such as hanging out with old friends, missing meetings. But my favorite one is, my family are going away on that weekend. So if I start using then and stop on that day, they won't even know. So they start to plan that around. They start prioritizing their relapse as opposed to prioritizing their recovery. Next slide, please. Okay. So just before I get into the techniques for dealing with relapses and dealing with mental relapses and how to kind of pull themselves out, I don't know if there's any questions so far or anyone would like to make any comments before I move on, or Katu, if you want to add anything.
I saw there was a question in the chat earlier. So Trevor says, thanks, Dom, for that. What does one do if a loved one is in contact on WhatsApp every day with someone that has been in treatment? What do we do?
I think that's a bit of a difficult one because you can't really control, like, if they make friends in rehab, that's fine. But obviously you can't control if that person is using or not. Because obviously I'm sure some of you on this platform know that coming to rehab once is not going to fix the problem. You can't really control who they speak to, who they don't speak to. It's very difficult to monitor that. But again, I think that brings it back to that self-awareness of, okay, I see you chatting to so and so. These are my concerns, and just be careful. I think that would be the best way to approach it, is to say, look, you believe you're talking to XYZ, and maybe just alleviate or let them know, what your concerns may be for that.
Yeah, and I also think maybe just when you do communicate your concerns with them, how they react. Are they being defensive? Are they hiding things from you? Are they open to communicating with you about the person? So just looking out for those signs that Dom mentioned earlier as well. So
There's another.
yeah, sorry. What you just said makes me terrified of leaving them alone. Is there a guide for times not to leave them, early recovery, and at what stage could they be left alone?
I think that's a really good question. Just purely because I think, you as the loved ones, you get to experience this all from the outside. You can see, the pain they're causing themselves. You can see the pain they're causing you. It's a very good question. But I think the reality of it is that your loved one needs to take responsibility for their own recovery. And they need to do what they get taught. We teach them so many coping mechanisms, and some of them will be what I'm going to get into now. But I think it's also it's for them to rebuild that trust with you in order for you to go, okay, I can leave you by yourself now. I know that there's a lot of different sort of treatment options or options for loved ones. Like if you're concerned for them to come home alone, maybe look at going into a halfway house or into a secondary care facility, until such time they can increase their chances of good recovery. Because the reality is you can't walk on eggshells all day, and you can't baby them, because you're just going to put yourself into a really stressful situation. They need to do what they need to do. You can be there to support, and you can be there to make them aware of what your concerns are from time to time. But it is difficult. At some point, the bird has to leave the nest, if I can call it that. They can't have it's exhausting for you to watch them 24/7. They're going to have to be able to work recovery and rebuild that trust so that they are able to actually go and live by themselves. I don't know. I hope that answers the question.
There's just one more from Dumi. So they say, I'm afraid that this is where my loved one is. He has regressed back to his old patterns. My parents have reverted back to babying him. They are the ones initiating for him to attend meetings, and even so, he will be so reluctant, as though he's doing us a favor. Currently, he's been insisting on getting a car because he has been driven to the NA meetings ever since he's returned from rehab. I'm seeing all of these signs, but about him, but my parents are just happy that he is home where they can see him daily. That every time I ask how his studies are coming along or step work, he becomes so defensive. That is because he sleeps at 2 a.m. watching TV lately and wakes up in the afternoon. Sometimes goes a day without bathing. My family always call me stating I do not have peace when I bring up these concerns.
And I think that's again, it's another difficult one. I think it's a case of, we always need to kind of practice tough love. You're not going to convince. So some people are just very difficult to have their ways changed. And sometimes in situations like that, the best thing is to just walk away. Because again, you can't, as much as it's really, I know it's easier said than done. It's very difficult to just walk away from someone that you love, that you can see is suffering, and that's not willing to do anything to change their lives. But also you can't teach, I don't know, teach a dog teach Teach
And
old dogs new tricks.
yes.
Sorry, I forgot how that went. But it's, it's again encouraging family. Please do family group. If they don't want to do it, they don't want to do it. You can't force people to do those things, and you can do what you can do that's going to be best for you to assist. And at some point, it's worth looking at. Maybe I should walk away. Which is really difficult because you loved your family, you love your loved one, and it's hard, but sometimes it's going to be better for, that's the only way they're going to learn is if they experience those consequences.
Yeah, sorry, just to add, and I think that's where the boundaries come in. So if you've set specific boundaries with your loved one and they're crossing those boundaries, there has to be consequences to that, and you have to be willing to stick to those consequences that you set as well.
Okay. Are there any others, or?
No, that's all for now.
So I'm going to just go through some of the techniques that your loved one can use, and maybe for you as family members to kind of have some awareness around, so you can maybe try and assist them with these if they ever get stuck in a situation like this. The first one we say is usually play the tape through or play the movie through. As I mentioned earlier, it's very difficult. It's like it's a disease of forgetfulness. So the longer things go well, and the longer we're in recovery, and the longer things are going well, we forget the consequences. So what often happens is when your loved one gets stuck into a state of this obsession of like fantasizing and glamorizing, be like, sure, you can go and have a drink, no problem. But what's going to happen after that drink? Where is that drink going to lead you? What consequences is going to come up if you drink? Your wife has said to you, you drink again, I'm leaving you. Is that something that's worth it just for one drink? So it's really just playing that movie through. What is going to happen? Sure, I can have a drink, but where's that going to lead me? I can go to the draw, but what are the risks and what is going to happen if I do X, Y, Z? And that's something you can also maybe encourage your family members. Like if you've set a boundary in a conjoint that said, like, if you use again, you're going to get kicked out of the house. Follow through with that. Don't go back on that. Stick to it. Follow through with it. I know it's difficult. I know you love your family and you don't want to see them out on the streets. But with addiction, they need to experience these consequences, or they are never going to take it seriously. I'm not saying everyone has to kick everybody out on the streets. I was just using it as an example. Addicts and alcoholics need to experience consequences. If they don't, they're just going to be like, it's cool, my family will bail me out. It's not a problem. Because the family's done that for so long, so it's really important that they play the movie through. You encourage them and you say, look, this is what was said to you. This is what's in your recovery contract. Don't do it. So that's one option. We can move to the next one. They can talk to a trusted peer, whether it's a loved one or whether it's their sponsor or someone in the fellowship. Somebody that they can trust. They can say, listen, look, I'm feeling really bad today. I'm really craving. I want to go and buy a beer after this meeting. If you're an addict in recovery and you come home and you tell your mother or your wife or your father or whoever it is, I really had a bad day, I really feel like a beer, chances are you're going to book them back into treatment before anything else. But they should also be able to come and, confide in you that, like, I'm really craving today, or share it at a meeting. So we always say, like, sitting in your head is a bad place to be. So they really need to start talking about it and start opening up about how they really are feeling. Next slide, please. Cravings generally last 30 minutes. It's the obsession that gets them longer. So normally we say when you're starting to crave or you're feeling like you want to use, then it's a case of, wait for 30 minutes, do something to distract yourself, go and do some step work, go for a walk, just to kind of get yourself out of your head and move forward with that. I think that's really important. We can go to the next one. Oh, there we go. It's there. also just most important is what we teach them is one day at a time. We can't guarantee that your loved one is going to be abstinent or clean and sober for the rest of their lives. Sorry. Oh, excuse me. Oh goodness, sorry. um, it's a one day at a time program. And often I like to tell people that, when they come into early recovery, they're really struggling. The best thing you can say to them is like, just for today, I'm not going to drink, I'm not going to use, I'm going to go to a meeting. Tomorrow I will have a big fat party and get completely wasted, but today I'm not going to use. And then they wake up the next day and they say exactly the same thing. It sounds silly, but it works. Um, and I think it's really just trying to get them to understand that you can't set a goal like I'm going to be clean. I want to get to a year clean. It's you can't do that in recovery. It has to be a one day at a time situation. So we always teach them be in the here and now, be where your feet are. So that's really that's why it's such a good cliche because it actually works. Next slide, please. So the next one is also we can use relaxation techniques. A lot of the time we will teach them about breathing exercises. We will teach them about meditation. Journaling is a really good one. Just putting pen to paper really does help. Reflecting on their day. These are all little things that we can teach them just to try and help to alleviate the physicalness and the mental stuff that comes up when they are craving, or if they do feel like using or doing something that they shouldn't be doing, like hanging out with old friends, for example. So relaxation techniques are really, really important. Next slide, please. Okay, and then lastly, we have the last stage, which is the physical stage. This is the pretty obvious one. This is where they actually physically go into a relapse. They don't take the time to acknowledge and address any of the symptoms that have come up for mental relapses. It doesn't take them long to lead down that path to a physical one. The key for them is to reach out for help if they find themselves in that sense of I'm going to pick up. But then again, it's easier said than done. But I think that's why creating the self-awareness of what signs and symptoms could be leading towards a relapse is really, really important. And I think for you as family members, it's really nice to create that awareness. Like, listen, I've noticed you're a bit irritable the last couple of days. Are you okay? What's going on? Have you spoken to your sponsor? Just kind of be there for some care and support. Next slide, please. I think we're pretty much done. Yeah. So here's this. I thought this was quite cute, so I thought I'd include it. Is we have 12 steps of recovery, but we also have 12 steps to a relapse. So the first one is to start missing meetings for any reasons. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm too tired, I don't feel like it. Number two, become critical of the methods used by other members who may not agree with them in everything. Number three is to nurse the idea that someday, somehow, they can drink or use again and control it. Next slide, please. Number four, let the other fellows do their 12-step work in their group. They are too busy. So like, I'll just come to a meeting, I won't say anything, I won't help my sponsees, nothing. Number five, become conscious of their seniority and view every member with a skeptical eye. Number six, become so pleased with their views of the program that they, consider themselves an elder. I know everything. I'm the bee's knees. Next slide, please. Seven, start a small clique within their own group composed of few members who see eye to eye with them. I don't agree with that person because they called me out. I'm going to start a group with these people because they agreed with me. Number eight, tell a new member that they themselves do not take the 12 steps seriously. So, for example, someone that's been clean for 10 years comes in, oh, no, you don't need to do step 8 and 9. Please, you can just being clean is going to work. Number 9, let their mind dwell more and more on how they are helping others rather than how the program is helping them. So they'll start focusing on everybody else except their own. And then lastly, number 10, if an unfortunate member has a slip, become very judgmental. Like, oh, geez, how could you do that? 11, borrowing money from other members, then stay away from the meeting to avoid embarrassment. And lastly, 12, look upon the 24-hour plan as a vital thing for new members, but not for themselves, as they've outgrown the need for that long ago. Okay, so those are just, I thought that was quite cute to add in the back. So yeah, I think we've got about good 10 or 15 so minutes left over. If anyone has any questions or would like to share anything from their own experiences.
Dom, so there's a question in the chat. So Tumi just answered after we responded that it's just sad that he's my only brother and it's hard watching them enable him again. Right, yeah. And then
Mm.
someone said, please talk about the 12-hour plan on the previous slide.
I think that 12-hour plan is that just for today concept. Like, this is what I need to do today. I need to go to a meeting. I need to speak to my sponsor. I need to do some service at a meeting, connect with my higher power. I've got to go from work from this time to this time. So I've got this time to go to a meeting. So it's really just that just for today concept. Like, just for today, this is what I need to do and get done. Tomorrow is another day. We'll find out what else needs to happen. I think this is so important. I know that with our patients that go into halfway house, they have to do a weekly planner. I know it's not a 12-hour plan, but they specifically have to set out their week. This is when I'm working. This is when I'm going to meetings. This is who I'm at with this time. And it has to get submitted to a house manager. And that house manager then approves it. And whatever's on their, if it's not on their planner, Wednesday comes along, oh, but I need to go for coffee with so-and-so. It doesn't get done. Because what we're trying to teach is balance, routine, and structure. With active, generally it's a mess, everything's all over the place, but if we can just get them to live day by day and not worry about what's going to happen next year or next week or next month, then they can just focus on one step at a time. Katu, I'm not sure if there's anything you maybe want to add from your experience.
No, I think you covered everything, Dom. Just also in terms of the routine, how important it is so that they also have a sense of what's going on, right? Because like you said, it gets lost during active use. So maybe even holding them accountable with that. And then there's another question. At what point in recovery would triggers start to become more manageable?
I think that's also a really good question, and I think that's really what I would call a case by case basis. If your loved one is really working hard in their recovery, they're following the suggestions, they're doing their step work with a sponsor regularly, it's obviously then would be easier to manage those triggers than if they're not really doing what they've been suggested to do. I always say this is a very simple program for very complicated people. If we just do the 5 things we get told to do, which is speak to your sponsor, go to a meeting, do service, do some step work, and connect with your higher power each day, recovery is easy. But life on life's terms happens. And unfortunately, that's for each person or each individual to work out how they need to deal with that, if that makes sense.
Okay, and then Doreen asked the question, I'm trying to encourage my husband to get a hobby. He has been busy with other things, but is idle most of the time, which might be a trigger in the future. So, I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. I think with hobbies, it's very important for them to be open-minded. So sometimes it might be things that they've done in the past that they might want to try again, or they can explore other leisure or hobbies that are available in their context. So I think if you check online, if you say leisure exploration, it's like a it's like a little, it's not an assessment, but it just helps you figure out what things you might be interested in, what things you already liked, you might have forgotten about. So it just gives you like a sort of variety on what things you can try. It just gives you options on things that you can try. Maybe he might like it, maybe he might not, but just so that he's engaging. Also, maybe doing things with him initially might also help him. So trying out things with him. I'm not sure who he is, so I don't know him, but maybe trying things together might also encourage him to do a hobby when you guys have time.
I
I
think
don't.
hobbies, just
Mm,
before we move to the next couple, hobbies I think are very important.
mm,
Sometimes a hobby can give someone a sense of purpose. Sometimes it can give you a sense of importance, make you feel good about yourself. Um, at least then, it just gives you something to enjoy and look forward to. It's not just work, home, school, sleep, wake up, do the same thing next day. You got to give hobbies are great because they give you something to look forward to in the week, and they give you something that, gets you like, I mean, I'll give you an example. Like I have hobbies where I'm outdoors, I'm running, I'm doing things that I enjoy doing. Um, and it just helps give a little purpose, that you've got something that you look forward to and that can be beneficial for you, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally. It's really good for that sense. Ooh, I'm getting mumbled.
okay, and then so sorry, I have a lot of questions. That's okay. What do you think is a reasonable expectation or boundary for when I realize they are slipping? Is it an assessment at changes?
I think that could be one of them. I mean, there's a lot of different things that you could do. Like, for example, if you've noticed maybe some irritability or something that's, they're getting snappy or they're not being honest, you can say, "Can I drug test you?" That's normally the simplest, easiest one. Like, "I'm going to drug test you. You're not yourself. You're not talking to me. I'm confused." You can say, "Let's do a drug test." Um, maybe, okay, it could be an assessment, it changes. It would really be whatever works for you. I know that the drug test is usually the first thing that works quite well. And I think it would just be something that boundaries that you would need to set could be discussed maybe with your loved one's counselor, just in more depth as to what your needs are as a family member, and how best you can do that so that you are also supported.
And I think this is something that you can do like even before they leave or right after they leave, where you're setting these boundaries, and a weekly test would be the expectation so that they
Mhm.
already know what to expect. And then is there a way to avoid these triggers in the beginning of returning home without being overbearing or controlling?
Mm, I think it's difficult. It again goes back to that self-awareness. Like, the life is life. People come into treatment, they're getting help, they're working a program, but there are going to always be triggers. There's always going to be something that's going to come up outside that might upset them. Um, and again, I think it's really just, instead of being overbearing and controlling, rather be supportive and just say, "Look, I've noticed that you've been quite irritable lately. Please talk to me. What can I help with?" As opposed to, "You must do XYZ to make yourself feel better." I think that's always the best way, is creating the self-awareness and being supportive.
Okay.